Creating a scatter plot is our first step in both correlation and regression analyses. We want to visualize the relationship between our variables. We're going to learn how to create a scatter plot with a trend line using Microsoft Excel. For this example, I'm going to use the dog toys dataset, which is available on the first tab of the Visualizing Variables Week 4 Excel spreadsheet. That spreadsheet is available both in class and through a link in the description for this video. Let's take a look at our data, and then I'll tell you about the research question that we're going to answer. Here we see all of the data points for this data set. Many of them are like favorite toy or dog breed categorical variables, and these cannot be used for a scatter plot. However, we do have two scale level variables, the first being number of toys owned, and the second being days to fail. We're going to use both of these continuous variables for our scatter plot. And the research question that we can answer using these two scale variables in the form of a scatter plot: what is the relationship between number of toys owned and the days until the gift toy was chewed up? Is that relationship positive or negative? As one increases, does the other increase? Or as one increases, does the other decrease? That is what we're going to find out with this scatter plot. A scatter plot in Microsoft Excel is both the simplest and the most complicated example of the graphing that we're going to learn about. It's the simplest because it's really easy to create. But the scatter plot that is created is not suitable for our purposes. It is going to require a lot of formatting to get it into a look that is appropriate for an APA-style paper or for a classroom project. Let's begin by simply creating a scatter plot. To create our scatter plot with these data, we're going to go to the tab that says Scatter. This is our beginning point, and this is what our scatter plot is going to look like when we get finished. Let's go back to that Scatter tab, and we can increase the size and make it a little easier to see. You'll notice that we have the two scale variables in columns B and C, and I've already selected those columns, so I really am ready to begin right now. Anytime we create a chart in Microsoft Excel, we begin by using the Insert command. In the ribbon, click on Insert, and this option is available for the XY scatter. Click, and among the scatter options, we have this first one, which is also labeled Scatter. Click once, and our scatter plot appears. And already you can tell that this scatter plot is going to need a lot of editing in order to be ready to use and be in APA style. So let's talk about how to edit the chart elements and how to add that trend line that we're going to need. I'll begin by increasing the size of this scatter plot just a little bit, try to keep it in the same orientation. And all of the changes that we are going to make to the scatter plot right now will be found in the Add Chart Elements box. I'll quickly mention that if you click off of your scatter plot, it goes back to home. So be sure you've clicked on the scatter plot. That gives you the option for chart design. That's where you're going to find the Add Chart Element. We're going to be making several changes, none to the axes, but definitely to the axis title. In fact, we're going to add some axis titles. Let's start with the primary horizontal. I'm going to grab that axis title. I'm going to change it to Toys Owned. I'm going to do the same thing for my vertical axis. Go to Add Chart Element, Axis Titles, Primary Vertical. Now I'll grab that axis title, change that to Days to Failure. Next, I want to remove this chart title, which I could do simply by clicking on it and clicking delete, or I could go back to the add chart element, chart title, and change that to none. Now I'm going to get rid of my grid lines. Those don't belong in an APA style chart. Go to add chart element, grid lines, primary major horizontal, removes the horizontal grid lines, and grid lines, primary major vertical. Now we're cleaning up this chart dramatically. Already the scatter plot is looking better, but now we're going to need to add that trend line. We're going to do that by going to add chart element, trend line, and choosing linear. The linear trend line comes in as a dotted line, which of course is not APA style. You'll also notice these dots are blue instead of black, and the size of this scatter plot just isn't appropriate to the data. Now, these are all things that we can change. So let's go a little bit deeper into how we would edit our scatter plot. I want to begin formatting my scatter plot by changing both the X and the Y axis. To do that, I will begin by double-clicking on the axis. The horizontal axis, or the X axis, can be formatted using Format Axis, and then these axis options. Now the minimum is 0, that's correct, but the maximum for our data is 20. So I'm going to change the maximum to 20, and I want the units to remain at 5 and 1. Let's click off of that. And I notice there was a change that I didn't want. So I'm going to double click again, change those units to 5 and 1. And that changed automatically. There we go. That looks right. Do the same thing with our y-axis, or our vertical value axis. Double click. I get to my Format Axis options. And again, the minimum will be 0 and the maximum will be 20. Let's hope that these major and minor units stay as they are. And they changed again, so double click. Here's my Format Axis options. That's going to be a 5, which will automatically change the minor to a 1. And that is how this scatter plot is supposed to look. The major problem now is just the shape of that scatter plot, but we can fix that. I'm going to change the shape of this scatter plot by clicking on the scatter plot and then grabbing this handle down here in the lower right corner where it says Chart Area. There it is. Click that corner and I can drag this around to make it a little more square. It's still not quite what I want. Better, maybe, I think, yeah, that looks pretty good. And now I can move to formatting the trend line, which I'll do by first of all selecting the trend line. And notice they have a Format Trend Line set of options over here. Under the paint bucket, we see the options for automatic is going to be a solid line, although that doesn't actually change it yet. I want to make sure that my color is set to black. And to change the appearance of the line, I'm going to go to Dash Type and change that from dashed to a solid line. All right, that's a big improvement. But I also need to change the color of the individual dots. You notice if I click on any one dot, several of them are selected, but not all of them. And this is actually okay. I don't need to select all of the dots, just some of them will work for what we're going to do next. I'm going to go into that paint bucket again, and we see for the line, and change that to no line, or make sure it's set to no line. And then under marker, I have the fill and border. I'm going to go to the fill option instead of automatic. Change that to a solid fill, and make sure the color is set to black. Under border, let's make sure there's no line, which will shrink the size of those dots just slightly. And yeah, that's looking a whole lot better. Maybe make one more tiny adjustment there. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I want to make sure that the length of this horizontal axis is the same as the height of this vertical axis so that the scatter plot is in proportion. How then do we use this scatter plot to interpret the relationship between the X and Y axis, or the two variables that we have in our scatter plot? Remember that our research question was, What is the relationship between the number of toys owned and the days until the gift toy was chewed up? We see the information about the number of toys owned contained here on the x-axis. This is the low end of the axis where we have a 0. The values increase as we move to the right. Therefore, as the values of toys owned increases, we also see an increase in days to failure. As the days to fail increase, we have a positive relationship with toys owned. They're both moving upwards together. However, this line, this trend line, is not like a 45-degree line. It's just a slight upward line, which means that there is a weak relationship between these variables. Part of that weakness is just the nature of the relationship, but part of it is also due to this value right down here, which we're going to find out later is an outlier. In fact, there's really no reason to wait until later. Let's find that data point in toys owned, and it's the 20 right here. I can Windsorize that data point. I can cut it down to the next highest number, which I happen to know is 14. I'm going to change that 20 to a 15. And that is going to bring in this outlier. And you'll notice that the trend line itself became a little more steep or strengthened the relationship between these two variables. So I do see a positive relationship, but remember this is not a causal relationship. Toys owned is not causing days to failure or vice versa. There's just some positive relationship between them. We would want to explore that a little bit more as we look at the overall findings for our data set. And that is how you create and interpret a scatter plot with a trend line in Microsoft Excel.